He sold his own wife, and he believed that a signed paper and a closed ledger could erase the truth of what they were handing over. This is a dramatization inspired by themes of resistance in the antebellum South. At dawn, the plantation looked like a painted promise. Long rows of cotton bowed under the sun, the white columns of the big house catching the first light, the bayou slipping along its edge like a shadow. Neighbors who rode by saw prosperity, a housekeeper's china, a silver tea set, a lady in a bonnet tending her roses. Debts, though, grow in the dark. They nest in ledgers, in the quiet tapping of a pen, in whispered meetings behind closed shutters. Silas Beaumont carried both faces of the place. At the table he was the master, boots cleaned, waistcoat pressed, a voice that invited deference. He could still make creditors lean forward at the mention of his name. He could still charm a dozen men into a reckless bet. Yet for months the wagers had not tipped in his favor. He had lost fields to mortgages, sold horses, borrowed sums tied to other loans. Every victory at the card table left him farther from shore. The ledger on his desk was a geography of ruin. Names, sums, dates. At the bottom, small, clinical, an attempt to unmake the most inconvenient truth. Eleanor Beaumont kept her mornings in the rose garden, turning pages of novels that smelled faintly of lavender. She moved through her rooms with the ease of someone who had learned the language of decency. Table manners, the right way to fold a handkerchief, the smile practiced for callers. Born in a city parlor and reared with tutors, she knew phrases that made men think of gentility and instruction. She had married Silas when she was 20. People spoke of their match as a joining of means and manners. Neighbors praised the way she greeted company, the way she presided at dinner. They did not speak of the nights she lay awake and heard the ledgers tally like rain on a roof. The plan was never advertised in ink that said "wife for sale." That name, in the language of polite society, would have been an accusation too loud to keep. Instead, the paper called it a transfer of domestic service, a supervisor for a distant plantation, accompanied by a retinue of household women, a legal fiction, a word that would not be put into polite newspapers. Ambrose Thorne, the buyer, arrived from upriver with a hard mouth and a reputation that cut across the parish like a wind through the cane. He was an older planter, sun-streaked, his hands calloused not by gentle gardening, but by work, and a kindness not required of such men. People spoke the stories of his cruelty in low voices, a temper that bent backs as if they were branches, punishments administered with no witnesses. He wanted a woman who could keep a house and manage hands. He wanted a companion whose name would not make the neighbors lift their eyebrows. He wanted what his money could buy. Silas told himself that selling Eleanor would be decisive. With Ambrose's prices and the sale of some tracts just beyond the marsh, he could close his accounts, breathe. Perhaps gamble again with money that bore no mark of his own losses. He walked the parlor, while his hands smoothed the cloth, while creditors waited under the eaves of his pride. He spoke of assets as though there was nothing morally different between a head of cattle and a wife who had once read aloud to him by candlelight. He told himself, too, that she would be safe, kept as a companion, not sold beyond the reach of any plea. He convinced the men around him, and more dangerously he convinced himself. What Silas could not convince was Eleanor. She learned of the plan the way the house's servants learned so many things, by overheard fragments and the hush that followed them. A slip of paper, a man's cough, the way the footman's face tightened. At first she refused to accept the notion that her life could be parcelled out by a signature. She walked into the library one evening and found the ledger open, the entry naming Ambrose's estate, the line items, the sum he had promised, evidence that the decision had already been made. He saw her there, and with the slow, seasoned calm of a man who had sold other things to survive his vices, he offered her a reason that was both soft and final. "You understand," he said, planting his hands like anchors on the desk. "It's business. It's our only way back." She laughed once, a short, brittle sound. "Silas," she said, "you cannot melt me down and read the number aloud at the breakfast table." He tried to paint it as mercy. "You will have your own household to run, a respectable position. People will not know, no scandal." He spoke of propriety as a shield, but the ledger would not shield anyone from what the money bought. The housewomen, the ones who had taken tea with Eleanor and fixed her ribbons, were already objects in the calculus. 11 of them were named for transfer alongside her, women who had been with the house for years, who thawed the hard work of a household by sharing recipes, songs, and small kindnesses. They were counted like items to box for moving. The list was here, ink stamped with a buyer's seal. Josephine Jo Baptiste, 43, the one who had kept the nursery's children breathing when smallpox came. Benedicta Benny Laurent, 30, taught to read by a visiting schoolmistress, the woman whose hands could copy a letter or pen an essay. Marina Mary D. Duval, 25, swift with needle and thread, who could strip a hull of its secrets. Francine Marchand, 28, a midwife and a woman whose knowledge of bodies made men afraid. Rosaline Rose Baptiste, 20, nimble, keen-eyed, kin to Joe. Antoinette Tony Moreau, 35, seamstress and smuggler of small comforts. Joan Leroux, 50, an herbalist with stories folded in the lines around her mouth. Clara Bell, 22, watching, learning, always cataloguing. Esther Bellamy, 38, the cook who knew where the keys hung. Liza Caro, 27, who could manage horses and wagons. Mercy Dupré, 19, the youngest, who still hummed prayers under her breath. 11 names, each carrying long histories of labor, laughter, loss. Names the ledger pressed into a business transaction. Eleanor's name was there too, written differently, her name with a notation that made her stomach drop like a stone. The house that taught her how to be a lady had never taught her how to be property. The distinction eroded in a single clean signature. There was no ceremonial separation. The purchaser's men arrived with an ox cart and a driver who looked at the house with the kind of authority learned by being the one who moved goods. Ambrose Thorne did not disembark in a flourish. He watched quietly from the shade of his carriage as the women were gathered. Eyes met, skirts rustled, small children pressed into doorways to watch their mothers step into the slow world of travel. Eleanor carried with her 2 trunks of dresses, a satchel of books, and the baffled conviction that decorum would still protect her. She fit her hand into Silas's for a moment, an action that had once promised a future, and he released it the way a man might let a rope slip through his fingers. They left as the sun found the marsh, the cart raising a soft plume of dust that settled back onto the porch like a bruise. Neighbors watched until the cart became a speck. The big house resumed its posture, the columns like powdered teeth in the light, while in the fields the overseers moved like puppeteers, and the ledger stayed where it had been, open and completed. If you like historical reconstructions like this, subscribe for more. The journey would be 3 days. The first day they moved along red dirt roads that scarred the landscape and skirted cane fields. The wagon had a blanket hung on its side to keep sun off the women. A lantern swung when the light dropped. Men of Ambrose's household, 2 overseers who had ridden with the entourage, sat stiffly at the back. Caleb Moreau was the first, a broad-shouldered man with a jaw that never relaxed and an eye that measured worth in the set of a shoulder. Harlan Pike rode beside him, a lean man with a habit of smiling only when it suited his cruelty. They spoke little to the women. Authority in their town was a muscle. They flexed it through sudden shoves, a look that cut, a command to be quick. On the wagon the women shifted as the road jostled their bodies. Eleanor found herself in a pocket of silence that belonged more to strangers than to friends. Josephine sat with the air of someone who had saved energy for long use, glancing back at Eleanor once, then away. Benedicta sat with a small book in her lap, thumb silently tracing the edges of letters she had taught herself to love. Mercy hummed again, a spare hymn that no one asked the name of. At first the lines between mistress and housewomen held like pulled stitches. Eleanor watched them with the kind of observation that had been polite for so long, waiting to find where her place fit. But small things happened that a mistress's lessons had never prepared her for. When the cart lurched, it was Rose's hand that steadied Eleanor's elbow. When the first overseer barked a command that made Tony's knuckles white, it was Joan who leaned over and whispered how to hide small tools in a hem to make a seam look natural. A seamstress's pocket, Joan said, could be a vault if full of need. That night, the cart stopped on the edge of a wooded stretch. The men made a camp, their laughter thrown against the trees like a net. The women were pitched a small canopy near the horses. The bayou breathed in the dark, a wet sound that smelt of reeds and mud. Fireflies blinked like confessions. Men dealt cards and told stories to each other loudly enough to drown any unguarded talk. In that dimness, language shifted. Words dropped away. Eyes told other things. Benedicta showed Eleanor in careful privacy the simplest way to fold a receipt into a small tube, how to smooth the creases of a document so it might pass unnoticed. She could read the neat hand on Ambrose's agreement. She could tell when a signature had been pressed too hard. "Paper is a body," she said under her breath. "Write on it, and you can pass it off. Read it, and it reveals the lie inside." Eleanor listened to Benedicta with a mix of pity and hunger. Pity because the woman was relegated to secret arts. Hunger because the knowledge of letters opened doors in her mind that had been kept closed by a life of prescribed graces. Benedicta's literacy was not ornamental. It was a tool, one that could change trajectories. Eleanor, with her library and tutors, had never needed to forge a paper. Here the skill was survival. As the carriages rolled under a pale sun the second day, talk turned to Ambrose's estate. Rumors traveled like smoke. Some men repeated them as if they were folk songs. It was said that Ambrose liked women to be broken into quietness, that he purchased them as investments rather than companions. He kept his house clean of noise, the stories suggested, by making sure none of its occupants spoke against him. Some added a detail. A woman who had once been resilient on a neighbor's place had been driven to despair after a season with him. The women listened in various ways. Some swallowed the words and folded them away. Others let the images sit like nettles under the skin. On the second night, when the cart stopped at a small river crossing and the men drank themselves to sleep by the embers, Joe took Eleanor aside while the others feigned rest. Her face, lined by years of work, contained a steadiness Eleanor had not seen before. "You are a stranger to what will be done to you," Joe said. "Perhaps you think clothes and a parlor keep you safe. They do not." Eleanor's throat made a sound. Anger, incredulity, a betrayal that was itself a wound. "Silas promised," she said. "He promised I would be treated with something called civility," Joe finished. "A word worth less than a crust. Promises in these parts are like the wind. One day they warm you, the next they turn and cut you." The power of Joe's voice was not that she was loud. It was that she spoke facts as if they were stones. Weight, clear and unavoidable. Eleanor had always been sheltered from details that might complicate her view of good and evil. She had not understood that survival required the inventory of a life's hurts. That night, more whispers braided themselves. Tony pulled a length of rope from her hem and showed Mercy how to hold it in a way that could tie a wrist quick and tight. Liza bent an old hairpin until it became a lockpick. Esther counted out small coins she had hidden in the lining of a bread chest and placed them before the women in the hush of both calculation and ritual. Benedicta drew the outline of a document on a scrap and began to map out what words might persuade a stranger at a port to think a woman was free. Joan recited herbs that could numb the edge of a man's senses if put in a drink. None of these declarations had the bluntness of heroic vows. They were tools, small, practical, terrible blessings. Eleanor's mind became an arena. She thought of the curtain of roses that sheltered the house at home, of children who had once skipped along the lawns, of the man who had kissed her hand on the day of their wedding, and then kissed other things when he had the money to waste. She remembered how once, when a storm had come and trees fell like felled questions, Silas had told her to move into the cellar and not look out. He had been gentle then. Now he had decided she was marketable, and gentleness had a new cost. There was argument among the women that night. Some, like Rose and Mercy, spoke with the bright anger of the young. They could not stomach the journey, the thought of being held again by a stranger's hand. Others, older and carved by long injury like Joan and Joe, spoke in the voice of someone who had counted losses and learned how to risk for gain. "We can run," said Rose at one point, whispering sharp as a blade. "Leave the cart in the dark and split." "We cannot outrun the law," Benedicta said, "or the roads. They will take us and send us back, or worse." Tony's hands trembled as she argued for a plan that would make use of the men's complacency. They are fools when they are drunk. They leave their pride in the fire. Eleanor sat between them like a mirror, her hands folded and unfolded in her lap. In the parlor, she had been allowed to move through small tragedies that never threatened her life. A spilled teacup, a failed dinner. Here, in the belly of the wagon, the stakes were raw and close. The idea of killing a man, of ending a life, made a cold fog settle on her for a moment. She had been raised to believe that violence was for paperbacks and scandals, not for the hands of a woman who had once loved her husband. But which violence had she chosen by staying? Every ledger entry had been a quiet violence. Every signature had been a decision handed downward. When Jo spoke of killing as last resolve, she did so with the tightness of someone who had carried much and was not advocating blood as entertainment, but as a closing of a door that might otherwise be left open to ruin. "I do not say this because I love the deed," she said. "I say it because there are times when the only way you defend a life is by making the ones who would take it go silent." Eleanor's thought returned to the ledger. Silas had not simply sold her, he had sold the illusion that she belonged to a moral order. The realization reoriented her. If she had been property in the eyes of law and custom, she would have to see herself through a different lens. If survival demanded choices that her books had not taught her, she had to learn quickly. On the third day, the air around the cart had an unhurried, fat quality. The bayou loosened into creeks that smelled of iron and catfish. The men began to talk loudly of their plans, what they would do upon arrival, how they would inventory the household, how Ambrose would install Eleanor into a place without complaint. They joked about names as if naming could strip the soul from the thing itself. The women used the stopping places to their work. When the cart lay at noon in the shade of a lone oak, Tony and Liza slipped down to the river and returned with 2 dark bottles. Benedicta had scraped a copy of Ambrose's seal from a scrap during the first night, pressing it into wax and forging small signatures. Esther had simmered up a broth that could double as a sleeping draught if spiked just so, and Joan had gathered a leaf that would make a man's eyelids heavy. None of it felt theatrical. It felt like preparation. They moved like women who had learned to store danger in the seams of ordinary tasks. Eleanor helped with a half-smile and a heart that beat like a trapped bird. She bound up a handkerchief into a small bundle that would hide the forged papers. She stitched a hem just so, leaving a pocket to hold a short blade Jo had sharpened on the trip. She looked at the others, at their faces marked by seasons, and found herself saying things she had not thought she would. "If we do this, we do it together. No one is left behind." That sentence surprised her. It felt more like a promise than a proclamation of solidarity, a vow against the preference that had placed her above them in name, but not in fate. It made her think of how easily a life could be shifted by the law of money and the law of affection, and how those laws did not always run parallel. Plans required a map. Benedicta drew a small sketch of Ambrose's estate on a scrap, the house, the quarters, the path to the river. She had once worked at a neighbor's estate and knew how men arranged places to watch and to be watched. Using scraps of charcoal and a careful eye, she traced the likely positions of the overseers and the owner's carriage. It was not elegant. It was exact. "We do not need to kill everyone," she said. "We need to make sure we leave alive. Make sure they are not in a place to call back their guards." Her voice held the calculation of someone who had lived through making choices that saved children's lives. At dusk they pulled into Ambrose Thorne's yard. The place looked like a trap, tidy and lethal. Cypress shadows pooled around the house. Lantern light threw long bars across the drive. Men stepped out to meet them with a politeness that was itself a weapon. Ambrose met them in the lane, his hat tipped at an angle, and his smile even. He looked at Eleanor as if seeing merchandise, and then as if seeing a new curiosity. He did not shake hands so much as appraise the manner in which hands were offered. Eleanor felt the life she had known and the life ahead register like 2 notes in a chord that did not resolve. Ambrose spoke of arrangements, of rooms, of the convenience of a woman who could manage his house. He gestured to the overseers, and they moved with a quiet menace that suggested they had been rehearsed for all outcomes. Silas stood aside, finished with the transaction as if emotion had been checked at the door. Inside Ambrose's parlor, the air was cool and sharp. The men exchanged small talk that left no real space for misgivings. The women were shown to their quarters, a row of rooms that hinted not at hospitality but at ownership. They were to remain on the property. Ambrose's smile never faltered. He told a neighbor a joke that made the men laugh. The neighbors left. Everyone returned to their appointed roles in the theater of civility. At night, the house settled into the rhythms of a place that presumed command. The men drank and argued in one room. The women slept in another. The overseers made a point of showing their presence in fragments. A shadow gliding past a window, a boot on a stair. They used their authority like a muscle, once again exercising it for the satisfaction of being in control. That was the final hour before anything decisive. The women gathered in whispered circles where a light could not find them. They touched the ropes, the hairpin, the forged paper. They rehearsed small rehearsals, how to move when a door creaked, how to make a lantern blow out quickly so the men thought the night had turned against them. Joe walked among them with a look that was measured and hungry for the right moment. Benedicta folded her paper and hid it in a seam. Tony held the rope as if balancing a new weight. Mercy's humming had stopped. The hum had become a tight refrain held in the throat. Eleanor stood and looked at them all. The seamstress, the cook, the midwife, the healer, the literate woman, the carriage driver, the youngest, counting names like belongings she would rather keep than be balked of. There were 12 of them in all, herself and 11 women who had been treated as appendages of another's life. Each had skills, each had reasons. None of them came to the idea of violence as a triumph. They came because staying meant slow ruin, a pocket emptied, a soul wrung out. It was survival. It was also the beginning of a new definition of self. The plan they formed was not one of bloodthirst, but of precision. They would not announce themselves, they would not demand the world. They would strike where the men were least attentive, at a rest stop in the night when the overseers set their watch routine to the soft hum of a southern drink. They would seize the weapons, silence the alarm, and take the carriage or make a path to the river that Benedicta had mapped. They would not run mindless into the woods. They would do it like women who had counted inches and breaths. Eleanor's hands trembled when Joe gave her a small, blunt knife and a word about where to strike only if necessary. "If it comes to killing," Joe whispered, "make it swift, make it quick. Make it so the others do not have to watch for long." The weight of that instruction was not only about the act, it was about mercy in the form of quickness. It was about minimizing spectacle. The night before the attempt, Ambrose's house slept to the sound of the bayou and the cricket. Outside, the sky was a heavy, indifferent dome. Inside, the women lay awake in layers of cloth, listening for the sound of indecision in one another, for the moment when fear might become paralysis. They gave each other small practical gifts: Tony's needle, a strip of cloth to blindfold if needed, a tiny bundle of coins, and with them they gave a mutual promise that no one would be left. Eleanor, whose life had been a series of courteous refusals and acquiesced comforts, found herself thinking of a different grammar of living. She thought of how a ring had once symbolized a bond. Now the ring sat dull on her finger, a band that meant nothing in a ledger's finality. The idea of losing her life to a man's debt made her stomach flip, not with melodrama, but with the sober recognition of a traitor's bargain. She could not return to the life she had been promised. The only alternative was the one they had planned. They rose before dawn, pale and sharp-eyed. The house outside was still, a great animal breathing quietly. The men would be slow to suspect. The cart would be loaded for travel and left exposed. The river would be a road they could use if need be. Benedicta checked the forged papers for the last time. Joe adjusted the rope to a length that would not impede nimbleness. Tony tested a pin that would open a lock in a single careful twist. Mercy, the youngest, looked older than any of them as she folded the hem of a dress into a bite-sized roll and placed it in the pocket of Eleanor's skirt. There was no talk of victory. There was only the inventory of tools and a shared pulse of terror. They stepped into the dim corridor like soldiers into fog. The men's voices came from a room a floor down, the sound of a river running. Eleanor's heart pounded in her throat, and her palms found the small blade as if it had been there all her life. She remembered Silas's face in the library, and how he had smoothed the cloth and offered a word he called mercy. She remembered her own teaching: be reasonable, be polite. She folded those lessons like a dress she had outgrown. Outside, a lantern clicked as it was pushed from a table. The clang of a glass, a man's settled snore. The time was now or never. The women moved with the quiet of practiced animals, of people who have had to hide for months and decades, their steps a pact of silence. They reached the stair and Joe pressed a finger to her lips. They were moments from action when, at the top of the stairs, a small sound broke the world. A dog's bark, sharp as recognition. It cut through the dim like an alarm. Men stirred below. A light shut across the corridor. The firm, ordinary world of property and possession braced itself. Eleanor felt the plan flex like a branch in a storm. Something in her moved without asking permission, an instinct and an agreement. She thought of the ledger, the ink, the neatness of Silas's signatures, and she knew that whatever came next would forever unsettle the ledger's calm. The dog barked again. Steps approached. The lantern light rounded the corner of the stair and pooled like a challenge. The women pressed themselves against the wall and held their breath, counting off the beats that were left to them. The dog barked again. Steps thudded below. A lantern swung like a pulse, then rounded the stair, casting the women's faces into bands of light and shadow. For a moment everything was noise. Wood creaked, breath hitched, a spoon clattered in a bowl downstairs, and then Joe's hand, flat and sure, cut through the dark. They moved. They moved like a single, slow thing, practiced in the quiet of waiting. Joe led. Benedicta kept the map folded tight against her chest. Tony's rope was folded in her grip, like a coiled promise. Mercy's small fingers clenched the hem that hid the papers. Eleanor followed, the weight of a knife against the hollow of her palm, memory of the ledger as fresh as a burn beneath her ribs. Downstairs the men were loud in drunken comfort. Glasses knocked and voices rose in lazy triumph. Caleb Moreau's laugh rolled like a barrel. Harlan Pike argued with a neighbor over a horse he claimed to have bought in a card game. Ambrose's voice was low, practiced. The smile that had greeted them earlier now loose with the confidence of someone assured by others' submission. The plan had not meant for murder to be the first answer. They had meant to move silent, to steal the carriage, to vanish along the river Benedicta had traced in charcoal. But plans, like weather, change when you see the face of what you fled. The first act was what Benedicta had practiced with ink and patience, a tray of wine. The kind the men favored passed without fanfare. Joe placed it by Ambrose's elbow, and Rose, with hands steadier than her age suggested, tipped into Caleb's glass. A dark tincture simmered from Joan's herbs. It smelled faintly of mint and something bitter. The men drank. The house settled. The lull came like a tide. Eyes slid heavy. Voices thinned. Bones unknotted. Tony tightened her hold on the rope and signaled, the small angled jerk they had rehearsed, and the women were afloat on motion. They stepped, soft as folded cloth, into the rooms where the men slept in the vast masculinity of chairs and rugs. They moved as doctors between fevered bodies, quick, clinical, terrible. Harlan's boot thudded as he shifted in sleep. Mercy, the youngest, pressed a hand to his chest, fingers finding the place where breath counted. Benedicta and Joe worked in concert, a rope looped once, a scarf thrown, a careful wrist pinned against the floor. The house smelled of tobacco and spilled ale, and the faintly sweet smoke of the hearth. None of the women thought of spectacle. They thought of the things that keep a life from ending: silence, speed, removal. Caleb woke with the jolt of a net. He cursed, thick and animal, and his hand went for the gun hung at his hip. Joe moved as if she had been doing the exact motion for years. She struck the gun down with the flat of her palm and hit him with a force that made his head swivel. He yelped, a sound that was too human to be only a sound of failure, and then Benedicta's blade flashed, quick, necessary, and the light in the room changed. It was not a spectacle. It was a closing of an aperture that had been cruel for too long. Harlan was less willing to be tricked. He flailed. He found Tony's rope at his throat and felt fingers tighten like the press of a hand on a wound. In the scramble, there was the small inevitable violence of resistance. He lunged, a chair toppled, a lamp shattered. Rose's small frame moved with the speed of someone who had stitched life back into things and knew exactly where to press. The final strokes came and went with a terrible efficiency. Two men lay still where their authority had been practiced. No one who held the blade in that room felt triumph. There was a stunned high sorrow that ran through them like a current. Mercy wept once, A sound swallowed almost at once, and Benedicta bowed her head, not for belief, but for the thing that had to be witnessed in order to not be undone by it. Jo sat on the floor and wiped her hands on her skirt, as if cleaning were enough to make the world sensible again. They had not planned for Silas. He had followed the cart at a distance, the ledger heavy in his coat like a confession. He had told himself that a man could undo what he had done by retrieving what he had sold. He had said it in the morning to his creditors, in the night to his own conscience, and then acted on the lie with the arrogance of a man who thought property could be repossessed with a signature. He came up the lane like a wind that had not yet found its direction, thinking to offer a public recantation or at least a private claim. At the gate, as the women moved past with their stolen breath, Silas stepped into the lantern's arc and saw Eleanor. For a second, he looked like a man stripped of the costume he had been wearing for years. Shame came over him in a wave that seemed to come from the ledger itself. He went to her, voice trembling, not with apology, but with the attempt of it. "Eleanor," he said, the name an attempt to anchor himself. "Come back with me. I can make it right. I will make it right." She saw in him not the man she had married, the one who had read aloud and tucked her in the cellar, but the man who had weighed her on an account book and signed her into commerce. His hand reached out and closed like a trap. He tried to pull her toward the road he had chosen. The decision that split the world happened in a breath. Jo had been watching the lane. She saw Silas's figure cut the night. She moved with the same absence of theatre that had carried them through the house. Her hand caught his sleeve. Words came from both of them. Silas with a sudden mania, Jo with the cold voice of someone who had learned how to choose losses. There was a scuffle. Silas struck, a desperate small man's blow meant to regain what he had lost. In the grapple, the knife in Eleanor's hand slipped free. It slid, a clumsy arc, and found the place it had been meant to keep from happening. When they stepped back and the world recalibrated, Silas lay still on the red dirt, the lantern light painting his face in a way that made him seem younger than he had been. The others stood, the doorway framing each as if they were characters in a ledger Silas himself had once kept. Eleanor sank to her knees by his side. The anger she had stored folded into a terrible fatigue. She did not look triumphant. She looked hollowed out, as if some part of her had been emptied to make room for the reality of the choice. "We never wanted this," Benedicta said, the words like crossing a field no one wanted to name. "We wanted to stop being sold." A neighbor, awakened by the commotion, ran toward the house with a lantern and a curse on his lips. Ambrose's men, those who were awake and useful, staggered out into the yard, shouts rising like smoke. The women moved as they always had, together, a single, precise unit. They seized what they needed, coins from Esther's hidden place, a small chest of silver Ambrose kept for guests, a few barrels of provisions, and they pushed toward the river. Benedicta held the forged seal like a talisman. Jo held the rope, and Mercy held a paddle. Eleanor kept watch with eyes that had learned the architecture of survival. They did not look back. The river was a dark, knowing thing. Benedicta led them to a skiff Ambrose kept for quick evening trips, the kind that cut through marsh and cypress with less notice than a wagon on the road. They shoved it into the water with hands that had been trained to handle horses and pans and babies, and then the women became oars, a rhythm of blade and water that swallowed sound. The banks slipped by like a procession of the past. Fireflies blinked in the cypress like the slow applause of a sky that had no pity. Along the way they had to be more than fast. They had to be believable. Benedicta, with the forged seal tucked into a roll of cloth, presented herself at a way station as a woman traveling north with a group of hired help. Her script was a simple one, practiced in the hush of nights. She had learned how to bend a story until it could pass the sort of scrutiny that asked for papers. It bought them hours. Joe steersman, more interested in his own payment than the fine detail of freedom, let them pass. They took a ferry, and then, under the cover of reeds and late clouds, slipped off the main river into lesser channels where the law had less appetite and the whispers of free folk were more common. The escape did not erase the facts of the night. There were bodies behind them, and blood marked a ledger in a way ink never could. There were stories that would be told and rumored, and the official line was quick to assert itself: masked thieves, opportunistic attackers. Anything to keep the parish's sense of righteous authority intact. Papers printed that in the weeks that followed. Names were changed. Witness statements were incomplete, modified, sometimes outright invented. No magistrate put the ledger on trial. Life moved on across the white columns, but what moved the women was the small, stubborn business of rebuilding. They arrived at a sliver of shore near an island where people had long practiced the art of being unseen. It was not a place on any map that mattered to creditors. It was a place where a few free families, escaped, purchased free, or born free, kept house and taught trades, and took in those who needed a harbor. They were wary because mistaking hospitality for safety can be fatal, but they offered shelter. The women, 12 now, found the beginnings of a community that would not list them as assets. They turned the silver into a roof. They turned the provisions into food for a winter. Benedicta taught a circle of children how to make letters into tools. Jo became the one who held claim to the stories. She taught midwifery and kept watch over births that were greeted like small miracles, not accounts to be balanced. Tony set up a small workshop making and repairing garments. Liza tended the horses that needed a quieter hand than the overseers had ever offered. Joan's herbs kept fever at bay. Mercy, who had once hummed under her breath, learned to laugh out loud while mending sails. Eleanor, who had once been defined by lace and reading rooms, found a new occupation in a small room where she taught reading to anyone who wanted to learn, her voice steady, her lessons practical as bread. There were nights when the ledger's shadow loomed. Eleanor woke sometimes with the image of Silas's face burned into the back of her eyes, and she would weep not just for him, but for the life he had sold and the life she had to become. She did not try to pretend she was unscarred. She did not wear righteousness like armor. She taught the others to read, as Benedicta had taught her to regard papers, always with suspicion, always understanding that letters could mean freedom or prison. Ambrose Thorne never disappeared from the parish's gossip. He wrote long letters about what had happened, swearing he had been robbed by men in masks. The neighbors took pains to keep their distance from the scandal. The magistrate declared there had been no proof of complicity on the part of any household servants. Silas's death was recorded as a misfortune, a violent end to a troubled man who had been taken by strangers, and later as a cautionary tale used to counsel thrift and shunning of vice. In the ledger of public record, the names of the women dissolved into a footnote at best. Official memory flattened the story into something that could be taught to schoolboys. Keep your accounts in order. Crime begets crime. But memory lived elsewhere. In the kitchens of the island cottage, in the hush of the sewing room, in the slate chalked by children's hands, stories were told and retold, with the small, crucial details left intact. That the women had left Ambrose alive, that 2 overseers and a husband lay dead in a lane, that the 12 of them had paddled away into a freedom bought by coin, skill, and the kind of courage that demands a price. Years later, a young woman who had once been Mercy would stand on a bank and tell her daughter how Benedicta had taught her letters and how they read the papers to learn the names of places they would avoid. She would tell, without flourish, that sometimes survival is violent, not because the people thirst for blood, but because their options had been rendered so narrow that violence opens the only door. There were losses that never healed. There were days when a woman would sit too long by the river and watch a barge pass and feel the old ledgers tally like a hunger. There were times when old neighbors came seeking domestic help and were refused, and when a quiet satisfaction rose that had nothing to do with vindictiveness. They built a small school. They kept each other alive through births, through sicknesses, through days when winter's wet seemed bent on breaking them. They taught what they had learned: how to read a signature, where to hide a small blade, how to forge a paper that might pass the careless glance of an official, how to move through a town as if you belonged. Ambivalence survived them as it should have. Eleanor never became an avenger. She became a woman who counted the cost. When visitors asked her what had happened, she sometimes told the truth in a thin, even voice. Sometimes she offered a story that spared the listener the weight of the ledger's cruelty. The women who had acted did not celebrate the deaths. They named them as what they were, necessary outcomes of a night in which choices were fewer than fate. They held a ritual simple and human, Each year they lit a candle and read the names of the people they had been before the ledger wrote them down, and the names of those they had joined on that river night. They kept the list like a map. The parish moved on. Ambrose rebuilt his house in small ways, painted a new shutter, hired men who would be less conspicuous. He told the story of being robbed for years, and everyone accepted the story because it fit the shape of their world, that the strong are often inconvenienced by weaker forces. The deaths of Caleb and Harlan were written up as the result of a petty criminality that had no import for a community that preferred the comfort of neat explanations. But time cannot entirely erase the knowledge of what people do to keep themselves. The island community grew and became known by a few as a place where one could find refuge if one had the right introduction. The women taught and aged and left traces in the lives that followed. Benedicta's students became teachers. Joe's midwifery practices saved lives and passed on a language of care. Mercy's daughter learned to paddle at dawn and would in later years ferry small loads of food to indebted people who asked for it in the hush of a moonless night. When children shrugged at the ledger in the parish office and could not understand how a person might be written like an object, an old hand would sometimes point to a place where the sun struck the wood differently and say, "Some stories aren't in the book." The official record is a neat thing. It prefers the comfort of order. Real life remembers in less tidy ways. Years later, someone, an elderly woman with hands like maps, would walk to the banks of the bayou and watch the light on water and tell a boy the story as simply as a recipe. "We did what we had to do," she would say. "You will not find it in the papers, because that book belonged to the men who wrote it." The boy would ask, as boys do, about right and wrong, and she would answer with the kind of honesty that lived in their kitchen. Sometimes a choice that is wrong when you read it in a fine book is right when it keeps you breathing. The final ledger was not the one kept in an office. It was the record they kept of each other. Each name saved a detail. Joe's ruthless steadiness, Benedicta's quiet intelligence, Tony's hands that could bind wrists and hems with equal surety, Rose's small, quick fingers, Mercy's hum that had turned into a laugh, Liza's knowledge of animals, Joan's herbs, Esther's kitchen maps, Clara's observation, Antoinette's seam work, Marina's nimbleness, Eleanor's slow, steady teaching. 12 women, counting one another as proof against the world that would have reduced them to accounts. In the end, the ledger had been rewritten, but not without cost. 3 men lay dead in a lane whose dirt would not vote on who had been right. There was no triumphant caption to hang over the event. There was the simple truth of action and consequence, of desperation, and the fragile moral calculus that decides whether a life is defended by speech or by the closing of a hand. He had believed a paper could make everything rightful. The paper had not. What he had not expected was the force of those who had been told they owned nothing, who found ownership of themselves in a small skiff on a river under a shroud of dawn. They did more than flee. They remade lives. They taught children letters that could not be used to bind them. They kept memory alive in the slow, stubborn ways people pass knowledge from hand to hand. This is a dramatization inspired by themes of resistance in the antebellum South. Names, places, and certain events have been adapted for narrative effect. What do you make of it? Was this justice or simply survival in a world that left women with no other road? Share your thoughts below, and if this story moved you, pass it on to someone who needs to remember that history is often written by those who survive to tell it.